We've talked about this before on the channel, but custom games had a huge influence over my own personal love for Halo 3. So much of my time was spent playing Halo 3 custom games, and the excitement for what could come in the future with new Halo iterations was always something on my mind, especially as a release like Halo Reach would come closer and closer, just because I was so excited to see not only new custom games and new maps made in Forge, but also to see how there could be new takes on existing games that were so popular in the Halo 3 era. And despite the fact that to this day I still think Halo Reach is an excellent Halo game, I can't deny the fact that I was a little bit disappointed that in Halo Reach, upon its release, some of the main physics, properties on items, the way certain projectiles could interact with specific items, and the way that all of this would tie into individual item respawn and despawns actually heavily influenced the way that custom games in Forge would be approached moving forward, and a lot of games that were staples in the Halo 3 era of custom games all of a sudden weren't very viable anymore, or at least not without some massive revisions. Now back then, all I knew was that there was something off and something would happen weirdly whenever I would try to forge up a map and recreate some concept that I remembered from Halo 3, but the more and more I've thought about it and started to look back at Halo Reach's sandbox, the more I've actually realized that Reach had a pretty significant alteration to the way that the physics worked across the board compared to some specific instances and the way that things were treated in Halo 3. And so we wanted to jump into this and look specifically at some of these really interesting changes that made some of the best Halo 3 custom games completely impossible in Halo Reach. The first example of this is the classic Great Journey / Fat Kid game type from Halo 3. Now, a lot of you may know of the Fat Kid game type that is in Halo Reach, which is the same concept, though it is structured much differently. In the original Halo 3 days, the game consisted of one alpha zombie that would move very slow, while everyone else had brute shots and gravity hammers, or sometimes it was Fiesta weapons, and had to try to knock down barriers to progress through a large array of hallways that had other barriers and obstacles in the way. Now, the interesting thing about these barriers is that they were, in a way, destructible, as you could shoot them, and they would bypass where their original forge placement was and eventually collapse on the ground and then stay there long enough where if they didn't collapse the right way, you would have to continue to try to move these pieces until either the piece started a respawn process or you could jump your way through the tight barrier. In Halo Reach, Forge World actually omitted these barriers altogether, though they were in other parts of Forge mode, just not on Forge World. And while the concept of trying to get through obstacles while holding off the fast zombies and being worried about that very slow zombie with a lot of health would still exist in Halo Reach, the item selection that were used in a lot of the Reach versions of the maps were drastically different and didn't necessarily have the same application or the same gameplay loop of chipping away at a destructible barrier. It usually is something along the lines of moving a crate out of the way or trying to get through something before this door that's made out of grav lifts close. Now, interestingly enough, those original barriers, which in Halo Reach are called Jersey barriers, did appear on certain maps like New Alexandria and later on in the DLC map Ridgeline, and they could still be placed. And I actually remember when Ridgeline came out, I immediately decided, hey, I'm gonna forge a Fat Kid map using these barriers, and I had this whole tunnel system set up I was really excited about. But when it came to actually playing the game itself with these barriers, they don't work the same way that the Halo 3 barriers work. Now, they're still destructible to an extent and have those properties from Halo 3. However, the intrinsic despawning, which isn't something you can really take control of in Halo Reach's Forge mode, is a lot different than Halo 3's. Essentially, in Halo 3's, after the barrier has taken enough of a beating and its respawn timer would run its course that was predetermined and set, the barriers would despawn and then would respawn again, usually in a period of time of around 180 seconds. Whereas in Halo Reach, for whatever reason, there is something odd with these specific items in the way that their respawning activates upon the physics destruction of the piece. If you hit it it with something like a gravity hammer. Now, we tested a lot of different things to try to figure out what exactly causes this, but what we found out is if it's set on the default respawn timer, some of the barriers could just despawn altogether and never really come back. If we set it to never, the barriers could break and knock over and sometimes stick around or sometimes despawn. Or if you activated a respawn timer the same way you would with maybe if you're trying to test around with the settings to get it to work right, you could end up with double, triple, or quadruple the amount of barriers you're supposed to have. And you can even exemplify this if you switch the runtime so there's always an obstacle. So what would end up happening is even if you had a course already set up and you had things set optimally, the best case scenario is your players who are trying to break through the barrier would sit there hammering away at the barrier while it tries to break, and maybe it does break, and either all the barriers will end up despawning and you just run through, making it not a challenge at all and making it impossible for the alpha zombie to get any minions to help him out, or you can make it where the barriers just keep respawning infinitely until you have more than enough barriers. This is why this game type was altered so dramatically in variations in Halo Reach and why you don't see jersey barriers showing up in custom game nights, but it is really interesting to see a dramatic impact on items that were not classified as a fixed item that would lock into place and that could be interacted with and destructible. Another big example of this is the very popular custom game Jenga, which a lot of people remember playing back in the Halo 3 days. It was straight up either a Jenga tower or a Jenga wall, and you would run on it and one alpha zombie would knock items into the tower and the tower would collapse on itself as it's built completely off of scenery items or destructible items that don't have a locked in place when you spawn them in. Now, mostly in Forge across all iterations, most of the structural items are lockable, where as soon as you place them, they're just locked in place after a couple of seconds, even if you're not using the fixed or phased functions. If you use normal function, you interact with it for a few seconds and then it locks in place. However, there were of course a select group of items that were interactable throughout the entirety of a match, like those barriers that we talked about earlier. And in this case, the barriers were used for these Jenga towers, and it was really cool that you could just launch other interactable items that weren't locked in place on these cannons and it would hit the Jenga tower and break it down. Trash Compactor was another great example because it really utilized what was items that could be moved, as you could knock them into this trash compactor and all these players would be running around trying the best that they could to survive. But with Halo Reach, these game types weren't really viable. Sure, there were newer versions of Jenga Tower that were made using these crates, but this isn't really the same spirit of Jenga Tower. It doesn't even look like a Jenga Tower. And there were versions of Trash Compactor, but it only utilized the much smaller pool of items that could be moved around, like soccer balls. It didn't have the same oomph and velocity that Halo 3 originally had in its physics engine. At this point, I don't even know what I'm going on about. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk on why some custom games are best played in Halo 3 over Halo Reach. But there's other examples too of how a slight change in the physics engine could drastically change the impact of a lot of these custom game modes. In Halo 3, Frogger by far was one of my favorite game types. It's this concept where a tank is in the middle of the map and a zombie is in it shooting at everyone else who has to hop from these lily pad platforms to other lily pad platforms, driving vehicles and going off of these cannons, and it's a hilarious, fun time. If you can survive till the end, you get a chance to kill the zombie and end the round, and this was just so much fun back in the day because you could just drive and try to sneak around the zombie without him seeing you. You could team up with your buddies and ride together. It was a lot of fun, and this was another one I tried to recreate in Halo Reach, though ultimately the Reach version of Frogger never ended up being nearly as great or felt as good as the Halo 3 variations because the tank itself had been updated to have a much heavier pull when you're shooting the cannon, making it where you almost had to lead your shots significantly when you were in the Scorpion, as opposed to how you could line up your shots almost like a sniper rifle in the Halo 3 version. So in general, it made it a lot easier in Halo 3, which made the balancing of trying to survive and beating the zombie a lot more challenging, which was the fun part of the game, where if you're trying to shoot vehicles out of the air in a tank in Halo Reach, it's much harder than doing it in Halo 3. Another game type a lot of people remember from the Halo 3 days is the Halo game type, also sometimes called Drive or Survive, which is also used as a sand trap map, so we'll just call it Halo here. But essentially, it's a large ring, and you have to drive your vehicle around and avoid getting shot at by the zombie. Now, the thing that you run into on this game type a lot of the time is the zombie has a few different weapons and a few options of how to approach taking out the drivers, but a lot of the times if you weren't the best at sniping and you couldn't pick off the perfect headshots to kill the drivers, you could knock them off by hitting their mongoose just the right way. And when I was a young teenager, I don't know, I was in a custom game lobby one time and everyone was calling it McQueening, like a verb based off of Lightning McQueen or something. Like they'd be like, oh no, you're gonna McQueen me, or oh, I'm McQueened off of the edge. But essentially it was where the sniper rifle would hit the wheel of the mongoose and shift the momentum. And a lot of the times the driver tries to correct the momentum and it would cause the reverse momentum to occur and overcorrect the mongoose and you'd lose control and fly off the edge. This happened a lot and it was kind of a part of the game. And this feature isn't really commonplace in Halo Reach, as the whole interaction between sniper rifles and mongooses don't work the same way as they did once upon a time in Halo 3. I think to this day a lot of people still don't appreciate how amazing Halo 3 custom games was for its time and its versatility, and how Halo Reach would still try to recreate a lot of these games and never lived up to the same par that Halo 3 had set. Now, don't get me wrong, Halo Reach had some amazing custom games that were only possible because of Reach's sandbox and the Forge abilities that were introduced in Halo Reach. But those games in Halo 3 were still really special back in the day, and there is something to be said about how Halo 3's physics engine worked differently. Now, of course, one interesting thing you can do in Halo Reach that you couldn't do in Halo 3 is involving putting a tower down and putting a vehicle grav lift inside of it, and then setting both of the physics to normal, and then picking up both of them quickly and dropping them. And then you have this just hot air balloon that'll fly through the air, and it's really fun to try to survive when you're playing with some friends. We were just flying around hoping that it would last as long in the air as possible without flying into a cliff. And after a few trials and errors, we eventually had one of these hot air balloon buildings just fly for the longest time. We all had fallen out multiple times and we watched it dip into the water thinking it was over, only just to emerge once again and save itself. And then it just flew off into the sunset and we watched it go and then just despawned. But still, it was something really fun to watch, just based on using the Halo engine in a way that you wouldn't expect to use the engine, and it was pretty neat. It is really interesting though to look at how in various Halo games the way that physics and momentum and movement applies differently to players based on what game you're playing. For instance, in Halo 3, you could stand on top of a vehicle that's moving at a high speed, and if it goes off of a jump or something like that, that movement of the Warthog would still transfer over to the Spartan that's standing on top of the vehicle, which made it where in situations like Frogger, for example, you could just ride on top of the vehicles and just make sure you're lined up most of the time, and you had a decent enough chance at staying on the whole ride or surviving. Of course, there's always the chance you could fall off, but for the most part, it was possible. Halo Reach, on the other hand, if you try to stand on top of the vehicle and then the vehicle goes off of a grav lift, the vehicle momentum will pick up and the Spartan may even take a little bit of damage, but ultimately the Spartan will never reach the same speed as the vehicle that he's standing on and will likely fall to his death more often than not. Now, one of the leading theories that likely is around why these physics engines are affected in the way that they are is probably something to do with massive desync that can happen in multiplayer servers or even in local co-op games. When one player is interacting with an object, the game still has to tell the whole server or all the other players connected how this object is individually moving, even if it is the slightest. And that could be very taxing on a game engine, especially one that was still built on the Xbox 360. So perhaps the idea of going bigger and bolder with Halo Reach's Forge mode may have also had to have some sacrifices, like the amount of items that could individually be utilized and interactable, like a jersey barrier, for example, where it would then have to update all of the players in the game to explain how deteriorated an item like that is, or when the item is supposed to despawn or respawn or have more spawning in. Then you multiply that by the amount of items and on a large scale map, and perhaps there could be some more issues with desync. This is just a theory at this point, and maybe someone out there knows way more about video game engines and could shed some light on it for us, but it is something worth noting. And I think it's always really interesting to see how, at the end of the day, every Halo game is able to stand on its own and have its own identity surrounding it. If you look at Halo Combat Evolved's physics engine from all the way back in CE and then compare it to Halo 2's, it's night and day. They introduced a brand new type of of physics engine into Halo 2 to specifically make things interactable and better with the vehicles. So in a way, doing this with each game iteration kind of contributes to every Halo game having its own identity and feeling unique from one game to another, whether you're playing Halo 1 or Halo 3 or Reach or 5 Guardians. They're all going to be a unique experience in how the game actually plays, and that's something we think is kind of neat. But if you like this video, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss more videos like this. And if you're not subscribed and you're on the fence, go ahead and give it a subscribe. You can always change your mind later if you don't like what we put out, but I think you might like this stuff if you like Halo discussions. So that's it for today. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.